It is a strange thing to stand on a beach and wait for the end of the world. In the late summer of 480 BC, that is exactly what several thousand Greek sailors were doing on the northern tip of Euboea, a long island that hugs the coast of the Greek mainland. This place was called Artemisium. It was little more than a quiet stretch of pebbles and dirty sand. Behind the beach stood a temple to Artemis, the goddess of wild beasts. Ahead of it lay the open sea. Somewhere out there, hidden by the blue horizon, was the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. The Persians were coming. Their king, Xerxes, sat at the centre of a global power. He ruled an empire that stretched from the sun-drenched plains of India to the edges of the Aegean Sea. To Xerxes, Greece was a lingering stain on his father's honour that could only be washed away in blood. He carried the memory of the defeat at Marathon like a burning coal, a constant reminder that these puny Greeks had once dared to defy the great empire. To crush this defiance, he brought with him a force so large that it seemed to turn the earth into dust. His army drank rivers dry, and his ships made the sea look black with a wood. For the Greeks, the situation was desperate. They were a people who loved their independence, but they were almost always fighting one another. Now they had to stand together or be wiped out. They had a single, least terrifying question to answer. How do you stop a superpower when you only have a handful of men? But before we unravel how they endured this impossible situation, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, help us out by hitting the like button and subscribing, and please tell me where you're listening from today. I'd really love to hear from you. Strategy is often a game of geography. If you look at a map of Greece, you see a rugged landscape of mountains and deep bays. It is not a place for large open battles. A massive army needs space to move. It needs wide plains for its horses to run. The Greek strategy was to find a place where that space did not exist. They chose a mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. It was so narrow that only a single wagon could pass through at its tightest points. This is where King Leonidas and his 300 elite Spartans have taken their stand. If the Persians want to march into the heart of Greece, they have to go through Leonidas. But there was a problem. Thermopylae was on the coast. If the Persian navy could simply sail past the pass, they could land troops behind the Spartans. The brave soldiers on land would be surrounded and slaughtered in minutes. The land defence and the sea defence had to be perfectly timed. They were two parts of a single machine. This is why the fleet was at Artemisium. The man who truly understood it was Themistocles. He was what the Athenians called a man of twists and turns. He was brilliant, serpentine, and he saw the future more clearly than anyone else. He knew that the Persians had many more ships than the Greeks. The great king commanded over 1,000 triremes. The Greeks had roughly 300. In a fair fight on the open sea, the Greeks would lose. The Persians were better sailors, especially the Phoenicians. Their ships were faster and could turn on a dime. Themistocles knew he had to change the rules of the game. He had to force the Persians to fight in a space so small that their numbers wouldn't matter. The Straits at Artemisium were barely 6 miles wide. By plugging this gap, the Greek fleet could serve as a wooden wall. They would guard the side door to the land army at Thermopylae. If the Persians wanted to get past, they would have to drive through a solid line of Greek bronze rams. Standing on that beach, the Greek sailors felt the weight of this choice. Most of them were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, potters, and blacksmiths. They'd spent the last few months developing blisters on their hands as they learned to pull an oar. They were nervous and prone to panic. Every time a scout reported a new sighting of the Persian fleet, the admirals started arguing. Some wanted to run back to the safety of the south. But the geography of the straits pinned them there. The fate of every city in Greece now rested on this synchronization of land and sea. If the fleet failed, the army would fall. If the army fell, the cities would burn. As the August heat grew more intense, the Greeks watched the horizon for the first sign of the enemy. They were looking for a move that would test their nerves and their intelligence. They didn't have to wait long. The first Persian ships were already moving in the dark, and they were bringing a technical mastery that would throw the Greek commanders into a complete state of shock. The first strike against the Greek defence did not arrive with the roar of 1,000 ships. It came in the grey silence of a mid-August dawn off the island of Sciathos. This small, rugged island sat like a lonely sentry just north of the Greek fleet's main base at Artemisium. The Greeks had stationed 3 patrol ships there to act as lookouts for the approaching invasion. These crews felt relatively safe because they believed the sea was closed during the hours of darkness. Most sailors in the ancient world navigated by hugging the coastline and watching for familiar landmarks. To them, sailing across the open ocean at night was a recipe for a total shipwreck. But the invaders brought a level of technical mastery that the Greeks could not yet imagine. The most dangerous part of the Persian navy was not actually Persian, it was Phoenician. They were maritime experts from the merchant cities of modern-day Lebanon. Their borders, as one ancient prophet put it, were in the heart of the sea. They were the original sea rovers, men who had mastered the stars and the currents over centuries of trade. While the Greeks were still learning to pull a heavy oar, the Phoenicians were already building the most advanced warships in existence. Their triremes were faster and more manoeuvrable than anything the Greeks could put in the water. Most importantly, their crews were professionals who could navigate the open channel even under the pitch-black sky of midnight. And the elite among them were the Sidonians. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, the 3 Greek lookout ships were suddenly surrounded. 10 Sidonian triremes had swooped down from the darkness. The ambush was so perfect and so fast that the Greeks had no time to form a defensive line. 1 Greek ship from the city of Troezen surrendered almost immediately. The Sidonians did not just want to capture the vessel, they wanted to shatter Greek morale. They selected the most handsome man among the prisoners, a young sailor named Leon. Standing on the prow of their flagship, they ritually cut his throat as a sacrifice to their gods. It was a cold, calculated display of psychological warfare. They wanted the Greeks to know they were fighting a force of both technical and divine destiny. The second Greek ship put up a furious, desperate fight. Its marines fought until they were completely overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the Phoenician boarding parties. The Sidonians were so impressed by the bravery of one particular Greek fighter named Pythias. They treated his wounds with myrrh and feted him as a hero. The third ship, an Athenian trireme, managed to slip away into the shallows. Its crew eventually ran the ship aground and escaped on foot through the thick woods of the mainland. But the physical loss of the ships was only the beginning of the crisis. The real damage was the news that reached the main Greek camp back at the headland of Artemisium. When the fire beacons on the hills signalled the defeat at Sciathos, the Greek admirals were thrown into a state of absolute panic. They had chosen Artemisium because the narrow water was supposed to protect them from being surrounded. Now they realised the Phoenicians could find them in the dark and outrun them in the light. The technical gap between the 2 navies felt like an unbridgeable canyon. Fear spread through the wooden hulls of the Allied fleet like a contagion. Eurybiades, the Spartan high admiral, was particularly shaken by the news. He was an aristocrat who felt uncomfortable so far from the solid ground of his home in the Peloponnese. He began to vocalise what many others were already thinking. The Persians were simply invincible at sea. This was a moment of total strategic collapse. The Greeks did not wait for the main Persian armada to appear on the horizon. They launched their ships and began a headlong retreat to the south. They withdrew all the way to Chalcis, a city midway down the western coast of the island of Euboea. By moving here, they put a massive mountain ridge between themselves and the open ocean. They were essentially hiding from a fight they no longer believed they could win. Artemisium was left abandoned, and the side door to the land army at Thermopylae was now wide open. The entire plan to save Greece was on the verge of failing before the first main battle had even started. The Greek sailors sat in their ships at Chalcis and watched the beacons on the distant hills. They were waiting for a miracle or the end of their world. They had prayed for the winds to help them, but for days the air remained hot and still. As the August temperature continued to rise, a different kind of pressure began to build in the atmosphere. The heat was so intense that it felt like a heavy warning from the gods themselves. Every man in the fleet knew that a summer this hot always ended with a violent and sudden break in the weather. In that age, the weather wasn't just a background detail. It was a powerful force that could break an empire. The Persian fleet was rounding the Magnesian coast, a rugged stretch of land with high cliffs and almost no deep harbours. Because their fleet was so massive, they couldn't simply pull every boat onto a beach for the night. Instead, they moored them in long, tidy rows, 8 ships deep, jutting out into the open sea like a massive wooden pier. It was a brilliant display of organisation, but it left the Great King's navy entirely at the mercy of the open horizon. On the morning of the 3rd day of the heatwave, the air suddenly snapped. A violent gale, the Greeks called it a Hellesponta or a northeasterly summer storm, ripped across the water. In a matter of minutes, the Aegean was turned into a blender. For the Persians, there was nowhere to run. The warships in the outer rows were smashed by the first waves, and those closer to shore were ground into toothpicks against the jagged underwater rocks. For 3 full days, the storm roared, making it impossible for the Persians to maintain any kind of order. The sound would have been a nightmare. The howling of the wind mixed with the screeching of heavy cedar planks snapping like dry twigs. When the air finally cleared, the Magnesian shoreline was a massive graveyard. Thousands of Persian sailors were dead, and the surf was thick with floating grain bags, broken oars, and even carved chests of the Great King's gold. This was a massive system change for the entire war. The Greeks hadn't even fired a single arrow, or used a single bronze ram, yet their greatest enemy had been physically cut down to size. The Persian numerical advantage, which had felt like an immovable object, was suddenly eroded by the raw power of the environment. When the news reached the Greeks at Chalcis, they took it as a sign from the gods, and immediately rowed back to their defensive line at Artemisium. However, the Persian admirals were more than just ship captains. They were proud aristocrats serving a king who did not tolerate failure. They knew they had been humiliated by the sea, but they still possessed roughly 800 triremes. And now, the math of the war was changing. The Persian high command knew that a frontal assault on the narrow straits was exactly what the Greeks wanted. They couldn't afford another fair fight in that choke point if they wanted to win the war before the next storm hit. They needed a way to break the deadlock without charging into a bronze-tipped wall. To solve this, they reached for a classic strategic lever, the flanking manoeuvre. While the main body of the fleet sat at Aphytae, staring across the water at the Greeks, the admirals detached a secret task force of 200 ships. This squadron was ordered to sail around the eastern side of the island of Euboea, hidden by the high cliffs of the coastline. The plan was a pincer movement. While the main Persian fleet held the Greeks in place at the northern tip, these 200 ships would swing around the bottom of the island and come up from the south. They would bottle the Greeks up in the channel like fish in a net. It was a move designed to turn the Greeks' chosen defensive position into a tomb. In the ancient world, information was the most valuable currency, but it was also the hardest to move. The Persians took extreme precautions to keep their pincer move a secret, sailing their detachment out into the open sea to avoid being spotted by Greek lookouts on the Euboean heights. For a few hours, the strategy was invisible. The Greek admirals at Artemisium sat on their decks, unaware that 200 hulls were currently racing to cut off their only path of escape to the south. If this mechanism of secret movement succeeded, the war for Greece would have ended right there in the silence of those straits. But information has a funny way of leaking through the smallest cracks. In the Persian camp, there was a man named Sciathos, a professional diver from the city of Sione. He was a specialist in underwater salvage, a man who lived in the quiet blue pressure of the deep. For days, he had been waiting for a chance to desert the invaders and join his fellow Greeks. He watched the ships depart and realised what was happening. To deliver the warning, Sciathos didn't just walk out of camp. Legend says he dove into the sea and swam 10 miles, much of it underwater, to reach the Greek base at Artemisium. Whether he truly swam the whole way beneath the waves or simply used his specialised diving skills to slip past the Persian patrols, his arrival was a lightning bolt of intelligence. When Sciathos climbed onto the beach at Artemisium, shivering and gasping for air, he brought the Greeks a map of their own destruction. He told the admirals about the 200 ships and the trap that was currently closing behind them. The reaction among the Greek high command was immediate and sharp. Many of the admirals, including the Spartan Eurybiades, felt the old cold fingers of panic. They had barely survived the psychological shock of the first Persian scouts, and now they were being told their retreat was being cut off. The instinctive response was to launch the ships and run south immediately, hoping to punch through the pincer before it could tighten. However, the presence of Themistocles changed the rhythm of the room. He saw that the Persians had made a tactical error by dividing their forces. By sending away 200 ships, the Great King had thinned out his main battle line at Aphetae. Instead of running, Themistocles proposed something radical. The Greeks should stay and test the enemy. If they could strike the main Persian fleet now, they might prove to the wavering allies that the barbarians were not invincible gods of the sea. In the late afternoon, they decided to row out and provoke a fight. This decision marked a fundamental shift in the Greek mindset. They were no longer just hiding behind the geography of the straits. They were moving to test Persian naval superiority in open combat. As the sun began to tilt toward the horizon, the Greek triremes shoved off from the pebbles of Artemisium and rowed straight toward the massive Persian line. Ancient naval battles were often won by speed and space, and the Persians had both. If this were a foot race, the Greeks wouldn't even be in the same stadium, but Themistocles knew that a battle is not a race. He was about to turn the Persians' greatest strength into a cage that would trap them. The Greek rowers pulled at their oars in a slow, steady rhythm. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of wood hitting water and the low, heavy breathing of thousands of men. On the decks, the marines checked their spears. These were mostly Athenian citizens, men who had recently been farmers or potters. They were terrified. They looked out at the Persian fleet, a literal forest of masts stretching for miles, and they felt very small. But they were moving because intelligence had given them a window of opportunity. When the Persian admirals saw the Greeks approaching, they likely laughed. They saw a tiny force coming out to meet a giant. To the Persians, it looked like easy prey. They didn't even bother with complex maneuvers. They simply began to fan out, looking to wrap around the Greeks like a blanket. This was the moment of supreme danger. In a standard naval fight, if your enemy gets behind you or hits your side, the battle is over. Your oars are sheared off, your hull is crushed, and your men drown in the dark water. As the two fleets closed the distance, the Greeks did something the Persians didn't expect. Instead of trying to maintain a long, thin line that would have been easily broken, the Greeks pulled back. They drew their ships into a tight circular formation. We call this the hedgehog, but the Greeks knew it as the kyklaos. Imagine a massive wheel of ships. The sterns, the back ends of the boats were all pointed inward toward the centre of the circle. The prows, fitted with heavy bronze rams, were pointed outward in every direction. It looked like a crown of thorns made of wood and metal. By doing this, the Greeks effectively removed their flanks. There was no side to hit. No matter which way a Persian ship tried to approach, it was staring directly into the teeth of a Greek ram. The Persians were baffled. Their superior speed was now useless because there was nowhere to manoeuvre. They began to swarm around the Greek circle, their ships crowding together in the narrow channel. This was exactly what Themistocles wanted. The Persians were so packed that they started to foul their own oars. The water between the ships became a chaotic mess of splashing wood and shouting voices. Then, at a signal, the hedgehog exploded outward. The Greek ships suddenly surged from their circle, driving their bronze rams into the thin wooden sides of the crowded Persian triremes. A trireme was essentially a human-powered missile, and when that bronze tip hit a hull, it didn't just poke a hole, it shattered the timber. The sound would have been a deafening roar of snapping cedar and the screams of trapped rowers. In the tight space, the Persians couldn't turn to avoid the hits. The Greeks weren't just fighting, they were harvesting. In that late afternoon skirmish, they managed to capture 30 Persian ships. They didn't just sink them, they boarded them, killed the marines and took the vessels as trophies. It was a staggering psychological blow. The Greeks had just stood toe-to-toe with the lords of the sea and walked away with their prizes. As twilight began to settle over the straits, the fighting slowed. The two fleets separated like two exhausted boxers heading to their corners. The Greeks rowed back to their beach at Artemisium, towing their captured ships behind them. They were bleeding, and their ships were battered, but they were alive. Most importantly, they had proved a mechanism of war. In tight spaces, discipline and armour can overcome raw numbers. On the night after the first day of naval combat, the Greek sailors sat on the shingle at Artemisium, surrounded by the smell of roasting meat and the salt spray of the Aegean. But as the campfires burned low, the air began to change. The sweltering heat of the day didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew heavy and still. To a seasoned sailor, this stillness was a warning. Then the sky finally broke. It began with a sudden, violent howling of wind and a lashing rain that felt like needles against the skin. Thunder began to rumble over the mountains of Magnesia, a low guttural sound that shook the hulls of the beached ships. For the sailors at Artemisium, the storm was a shield. They were tucked inside the channel, protected by the high cliffs of the island. They were wet and cold, but they were safe. The 200 Persian ships on the outside of the island were not. They were sailing down the eastern coast of Euboea, a stretch of land that sailors feared for its lack of natural harbours. In ancient geography, this area was known as the Hollows. It was a jagged, unforgiving coastline where the cliffs dropped straight into the deep water. There were no sandy beaches here to pull a ship onto. There were only rocks that could shear through a wooden hull like a knife through papyrus. Imagine being on one of those triremes. The night is pitch black, illuminated only by sudden flashes of lightning that reveal white-capped waves as high as the masts. The wind is screaming, drowning out the shouts of the officers. The rowers are pulling at their oars, but they are fighting a losing battle against the current. The ships are running blind before the wind, tossed around like toys in a bathtub. One by one, the Persian ships were driven against the rocks of the hollows. The sound would have been horrific. The screeching of cedar planks snapping and the cries of thousands of men being swallowed by the boiled sea. By the time the sun rose, the Persian flanking force no longer existed. The elements had achieved in a single night what the entire Greek navy could not have done in a week of fighting. The Greeks would later call this divine intervention. They believed that the gods had stepped in to level the playing field, ensuring that the Persian numbers were physically reduced until they were a manageable size. It was a moment of strategic erasure. The threat to the Greek rear had been wiped off the map by the atmosphere itself. When the news of the shipwreck reached the Greek camp the following afternoon, the mood shifted instantly from dread to a quiet, grim confidence. They were no longer fish in a net. They were defenders with a clear path of retreat. Most importantly, they realized that the Great King's plan had failed. Xerxes had tried to be subtle. He had tried to trap them. Now he was left with only one option, a brutal frontal assault. It is one thing to survive a storm or win a small skirmish, but it is quite another to stand in the path of a desperate superpower that has finally run out of patience. By the third morning of the standoff, the Persian admirals had seen their clever flanking manoeuvres ruined by the weather and their elite scouts captured by the Greeks. They realized that trickery was no longer an option for their fleet. The math of the war was simple and cruel. They had more ships, more men, and a king watching from a golden throne who did not tolerate the sight of his navy hesitating. It was time for the Persian high command to use the mechanism of raw, concentrated force to end the Greek resistance once and for all. Around midday, the horizon off the coast of Magnesia began to boil with the sight of 1,000 wooden hulls. The Great King's navy, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, and the Ionians, began massing in the open water. They didn't approach in a simple line. Instead, they formed a massive sweeping crescent, a half-moon of wood designed to wrap its arms around the smaller Greek fleet and swallow it whole. The Greeks saw the trap closing around them. Themistocles had gambled his city's future on these ships, and the other admirals gave the signal to push the Greek vessels back into the surf. Imagine the sound of hundreds of triremes moving toward each other in a space barely 6 miles wide. The Greek rowers took their places on the wooden benches, their knuckles turning white as they gripped the oars. The air in the straits was heavy with the smell of salt spray and the sharp, sour stench of thousands of men terrified of the coming collision. As the fleets drew closer, the Persian crews raised a savage war chant that echoed off the high cliffs of Euboea. When the lines finally met, it was a pulverizing crash of metal into flesh and bone. Bronze rams, the heavy metal beaks on the front of the ships, tore through cedar planks like teeth through parchment. This was not a tactical victory for either side, but a brutal battle of attrition, where each man simply tried to outlast the person in front of him. The Persians were so numerous and so packed into the narrow channel that they often fouled their own oars. Their triremes collided with one another as they tried to push through the Greek line. The Greeks yelled to one another to hold the centre, while the Athenians on the wings took the full, crushing weight of the Phoenician assault. For hour after hour the August sun beat down on the bronze armour of the marines until the metal was hot enough to burn their skin. Themistocles watched from the deck of his flagship as the wooden ships he had convinced his people to build were systematically reduced to splinters. He was a man who lived by his wits, but here there was no room for cleverness, only for the endurance of his rowers. He knew that every Athenian ship lost was a piece of his city's future gone forever. By the time the sun finally began to sink behind the western mountains, the two fleets pulled apart like two exhausted, bleeding animals. The Greeks had technically held the straits. The Persian navy had failed to break through to the south and clear the path to Athens. But the cost of this stalemate was devastating to the defenders. The Athenians, who had been the backbone of the entire line, had suffered the loss of half their effective strength. Their warships were waterlogged, their oars were snapped like twigs, and their hulls were shattered beyond any immediate repair. They were still at Artemisium, but they were physically spent and unable to face another full day of such pulverizing combat. As the sailors gathered the wreckage from the water to build funeral pyres for their dead, the mood on the beach was one of grim exhaustion. They had stood their ground against the greatest empire in the world, but the wooden wall they had built was now cracked and failing. They could no longer protect the sea by themselves. Everything now hung on the status of the land battle taking place just a few miles to the west. As long as the Spartans held the pass, the fleet had a reason to hold the straits. If the army at the Hot Gates had failed, then the desperate sacrifice of the Athenian rowers that afternoon had meant nothing at all. The sailors sat on the shingle, eyes fixed on the dark water, waiting for the one man who could tell them if their sacrifice still mattered. That man was Abronichus, a liaison officer tasked with keeping the land and sea forces in constant contact. He arrived in the dead of night, his small 30-oared scouting boat cutting a silent wake through the shallows. As he stepped onto the beach, the sailors saw his face in the torchlight, and the talk of a fourth day of battle died instantly. He didn't need to speak for the men to know that the silence from the mountains was the silence of the grave. The news Abronichus brought was total. The Hot Gates had been forced, Leonidas was dead, and the 300 Spartans who stood with him had been wiped out to the last man. The Persian immortals had found the mountain path, stabbed the Greek rear, and turned the pass into a slaughterhouse. For the admiral standing on the Euboean shore, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a strategic pivot that changed the geography of the entire war. With Thermopylae gone, the purpose of Artemisium vanished into the night air. The side door was no longer worth guarding because the house had already been broken into. If the Greek fleet stayed where it was, the Persian army could now march south, take the harbours behind them, and trap the allied ships in a cage of bronze and fire. The forward defence had snapped, and the only priority left was the preservation of the fleet for a final stand. The decision was made with a speed that only a desperate democracy can manage. There was no more arguing about bribes or Peloponnesian pride. The order was given to launch the ships immediately. This was not a panicked flight, but a calculated withdrawal. The ships slid into the water in a specific order, the Corinthians first, leading the way south, while the battered Athenians served as the rear guard, watching the dark horizon for any sign of a Persian pursuit. As the Greek ships pulled away from Artemisium, the sailors looked back at the shore. The fires they had lit to cook their last meal were still burning, a deceptive signal to the Persian scouts that the Greeks were still there. But the beach was empty. The goddess Artemis was left alone with her temple and the debris of 3 days of wreckage. The wooden wall was moving, retreating toward the heart of Greece, leaving the northern coast to the mercy of the Great King. The rapid naval retreat allowed the Persians to occupy the abandoned Greek base. But as Themistocles stood on the deck of his flagship, he was already thinking about the next trap. The Greek ships were moving south in a quiet and orderly line. The sky was still heavy with the scent of wood smoke and salt. Themistocles stood on the deck of his flagship and watched the coast of Euboea slip past. He was a man who lived by his wits. He knew that the physical wall of Greek ships was now broken. The land defence at the Hot Gates had been forced. The Persians were now marching into the heart of Greece. But Themistocles also knew that a war is not just fought with bronze and wood. It is fought with the hearts and minds of the men who pull the oars. War runs on human will. If you can break that will, you do not need to sink every ship. The Persian navy was a massive monolith, but it was made of many different stones. The most fragile foundation of that entire structure was the Ionian fleet. These were Greeks who lived on the coast of modern-day Turkey. They were the finest sailors in the Great King service. They were the brothers and cousins of the men currently retreating toward Athens. Themistocles saw a crack in the Persian foundation. He decided to drive a wedge into it. The Greek fleet had to stop for water. Triremes were very slim and held very little storage space. A crew of 200 men needed constant hydration in the August heat. Themistocles knew every natural spring and watering hole along the Euboean coast. He knew that the Persians would follow his path. He knew they would stop at the same springs to fill their jars. At every beach where the fleet paused, Themistocles went ashore. He did not just look for water. He carried a stonemason's chisel in his hand. On the flat white faces of the rocks near the springs, he began to write. He carved large, clear letters into the stone. The messages were directed specifically to the Ionian Greeks. He reminded them that they were the children of the same ancestors. He called them brothers. He asked them to remember that it was for their freedom that the war had first started. His words were a blend of a plea and a threat. He gave the Ionians a choice. He urged them to desert the Great King and join the Greek cause. If they could not do that, he asked them to fight poorly in the next battle. He told them to be cowards on purpose when the rams began to strike. He wanted to create an infection of doubt. If the Ionians read these words, they might feel a pull toward their homeland. But even if they didn't, the messages would still serve a purpose. Themistocles was practicing a form of strategic rot. He knew that Persian spies were everywhere. He knew that his messages would be reported back to the Persian high command. If the Great King read these inscriptions, he would stop trusting his best sailors. Xerxes would look at his Ionian captains and see potential traitors. Suspicion is a heavy burden for a commander. It slows down decisions. It creates hesitation in the heat of battle. The Great King did find the messages. He arrived at the watering holes as his army pushed south. Xerxes read the words carved into the rock. To his ears, they sounded like the desperate cries of a beaten man. He laughed at the Athenian admiral. He thought that a few words on a stone could never stop the momentum of his empire. Xerxes believed his victory was inevitable. He had already crushed the Spartans at the Hot Gates. To prove his point, he staged a horrific piece of theatre for his fleet. He invited the sailors to go to Thermopylae. He wanted them to see how he dealt with those who resisted his will. Thousands of sailors from the Phoenician and Ionian squadrons went ashore. They walked through the narrow pass. They saw the thousands of corpses rotting in the mud. At the centre of the road, Xerxes had placed a trophy. It was the head of King Leonidas, driven onto a wooden stake. It was a message of pure terror. It was designed to show the Ionians that the truth of the Great King was absolute. But Themistocles had a deeper understanding of the human heart. Fear can keep men in line, but it also creates deep, quiet resentment. The tremblers of the world are often the most dangerous when the tide begins to turn. By carving his words into the rocks, Themistocles was playing a long game. He was waiting for the moment when the Persian machine would enter a tight space again. He was preparing for a day when the Great King's suspicion would be more lethal than a Greek ram. The retreat continued toward the south. The smoke from the burning villages of Boeotia followed them like a shadow. The Athenians were returning to a city that was about to be abandoned to the fire. The physical geography of the war was shifting to the Straits of Salamis. But the mental geography of the war had already changed. The conflict was no longer just about who held the narrow water. It was about who held the loyalties of the men who rowed the ships. While the smoke rose from the ruins of Athens, the Greek sailors sat on the island of Salamis and looked at their ships. To many observers, the retreat from the north looked like a total disaster. The great king now occupied their homes and his banners flew over the Acropolis. But for Themistocles, the 3 days of blood and salt spray at Artemisium were not a loss. They were an essential masterclass in the art of killing a superpower. Before Artemisium, the Greek sailors were mostly amateurs who lived in terror of the Persian name. They had seen the Phoenician triremes as invincible predators of the deep. They expected to be outsailed and outfought, but the stalemate in the narrow waters of Euboea had changed the Greek institutional mindset. They had learned a secret that Xerxes' generals were still too proud to see. In a tight space, a giant can be made to trip over his own feet. The Greeks had watched the superior Phoenician crews struggle to maneuver in the crowded channel. They saw that the Persian numbers, meant to wrap around them like a blanket, could be turned into a suffocating cage. Most importantly, they had felt the crunch of bronze into cedar. They had boarded Persian ships and walked away with prizes. The mystery of Persian naval superiority had been stripped away, revealing a force that was merely human. This was the true legacy of Artemisium. It provided the blueprint for the final trap at Salamis. Themistocles knew that if he could lure the great king into a place even narrower than Euboea, he could win the entire war in a single afternoon. He understood that a battle in close conditions worked to the Greeks' advantage. It neutralized the speed of the Phoenicians and the sheer weight of the imperial navy. Artemisium was the catalyst, because it taught the Greeks how to survive. It preserved the wooden wall just long enough for it to become a hammer. Years later, when the Athenians raised a colossal bronze statue of Athena on the Acropolis, they fashioned it from the plunder taken from the barbarians. Her spear point caught the light and served as a beacon for sailors coming home. It was a monument to a city that had burned but refused to break, and to a fleet that had learned, in the pebbles and spray of Artemisium, the secret of how to win its freedom. The lessons of the hot gates and the narrows had converged. The defence of Athens was complete. Artemisium had been the laboratory. Salamis would be the execution. And with that, our story of Artemisium and the first great test of the wooden wall comes to an end. Next time, we'll follow the Greek fleet south to the Straits of Salamis, where Themistocles will spring his final trap, and the fate of the Greek world will hinge on a single afternoon. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed the journey, subscribing is a simple, meaningful way to support the channel and help these stories reach more people who love history as much as we do. Until our next walk into the shadows of time, I hope the rest of your day is calm and peaceful.